Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling, well, one of the most sobering and complex subjects in human experience, interpersonal violence.
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely a heavy deep dive, but a necessary one, I think, because its roots are tangled in just about everything from, you know, neurobiology all the way to cultural norms.
That's exactly right. And when you look at violence, you really can't treat it as just one single monolithic problem. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
The academic sources we've pulled together, and it's quite a systematic breakdown of criminology research, they give us a really clear structural map. We're moving from the microscopic biological causes right up to cultural acceptance and then into specific legal categories of crime.
So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that complexity and deliver a truly well-informed understanding. We want to synthesize these different dimensions, the biological, psychological, sociological, and the legal stuff, so you, the listener, walk away with a clearer picture of why violence happens, how it shows up, and the really profound differences between its many forms.
Yeah.
We're going to explore causal theories, specific crimes like homicide and rape, and then also look at some emerging challenges like hate crimes and stalking.
And we're starting right at the most fundamental level, the individual. What actually causes a person to become violent?
Okay, let's unpack this then. When people usually talk about violence, the conversation often goes to poverty or maybe the media, but our source material actually starts much earlier. It focuses on individual pathology, like inherent biological and psychological differences you might find in aggressive individuals.
Right.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is the claim by neuroscientists that they can actually pinpoint physical differences in the brain. That's pretty specific.
It is, exactly. This isn't just, behavioral theory. It's looking at hard biology.
Yeah.
The research points specifically to two key brain regions that govern behavior. First, you've got the limbic system, which is essentially our emotional control center. It's heavily involved in those primal responses like fear, aggression, memory, that kind of thing. And second, there's the prefrontal cortex, which sits right at the front of the brain and acts like the CEO. It's responsible for those executive functions like decision-making, planning, impulse control.
So the claim then is that actual differences in these areas effectively separate violent people from level-headed ones. Like if the limbic system is maybe overactive, you might feel extreme rage.
Right.
But if the prefrontal cortex isn't working properly, you lack the brake pedal to stop yourself from acting on it. Is that the idea?
That's basically the model, yeah. You could have a combination of potential overactivation of emotion and at the same time underperformance of rational control. And these biological differences, they seem to connect directly to early warning signs. The sources specifically note that children who commit acts of violence often show signs of neurological impairment, sometimes coupled with low intelligence, or in the most severe cases, outright psychotic symptoms. So this suggests that for at least some offenders, the stage for violence might be set by these inherent deficits long before the environment even plays a major role.
Okay, so if the stage is set biologically, this leads us right into one of the oldest debates, really, in human nature. The instinctual debate. This is our section 1.2, and we've got Freud on one side with his theory of these dual opposing drives.
Yeah, Freud proposed that all human behavior is governed by two fundamental instinctual drives. First, there's eros, the life instinct. That's what drives our need for creativity, survival, pleasure, so the positive, constructive force.
Right.
And then opposing it is thanatos, the death instinct. This is the internal drive towards, aggression, destruction, and ultimately a return to an inanimate state. So violence, in this view, is this constant, maybe necessary manifestation of thanatos pushing back against eros.
And then the ethologist Konrad Lorenz, he kind of backed this aggressive instinct idea, didn't he? Arguing that aggressive energy is like an internal resource produced by inbred instincts, totally separate from environmental forces.
Exactly. If you follow Lorenz, this urge for aggression just builds up inside the organism. And if it's not discharged somehow, maybe through ritual or sport, it will inevitably find a way out through violence, regardless of, how the person was raised or their circumstances.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, because the sociological counter-argument just completely contradicts this biological idea. This provides a major aha moment for you, the listener.
It does, because sociologist Randall Collins argues the exact opposite, that humans are actually inherently passive and emotionally clumsy even.
Passive. So if we're passive, where does violence come from then?
Well, Collins claims violence is purely and exclusively a function of social interaction. It's not innate, it's situational.
Wait, so if Collins is right, we're naturally peaceful maybe? And the violence we see is manufactured entirely by the dynamics of group interactions, social hierarchies, conflict situations. But if Freud and Lorenz are right, we're basically ticking time bombs of destruction just waiting for an outlet. Aren't these two views fundamentally incompatible when it comes to things like policy?
Oh, absolutely. They create a massive policy divide, which is why this contrast is so crucial to grasp. If you believe Collins, prevention efforts should focus entirely on changing social structures, maybe eliminating conflict arenas, improving social support systems.
All right, focus on the situation.
But if you believe Freud and Lorenz, prevention must focus on individual psychological intervention ways to channel or control that innate aggressive energy. It really shows how foundational these theories are to how society decides to respond.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, so while we're debating inherent nature versus social situation, we also have to look at one of the biggest external triggers, substance abuse. The link between drug and alcohol misuse and violence seems undeniable, right? But it's not just one single cause.
No, it's not. And we have to distinguish how they're linked. The sources identify 3 distinct pathways, and they often get confused in, popular discussion.
Okay, 3 pathways. Let's break those down.
Understanding these is really key to seeing the full scope of the problem. So first, we start with the psychopharmacological relationship.
Right.
This is the direct effect of the substance itself on the user's mind. So for example, alcohol lowers inhibitions, it distorts judgment, increases risk-taking. That makes a person more likely to respond violently to, say, a perceived slight. The substance chemically triggers the violence.
So this is like the classic bar fight scenario, right? Where intoxication just lets aggression boil over because the normal brakes are off.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, what are the next link? You said it's more about survival.
That's the economic compulsive behavior link. This describes violence committed by users who are desperate, not necessarily because they're intoxicated at that moment, but because they need money to maintain their addiction.
Oh, okay.
It shows up in crimes of opportunity like muggings, robbery, high-risk theft, where the violence is instrumental. It's a means to an economic end, basically feeding the addiction.
And the third one, the systemic link. This often involves maybe the largest scale of violence, but the least direct interaction with a specific victim.
Exactly. The systemic link refers to the violence that's structurally inherent in the illicit drug market itself. The turf wars, the violent enforcement of contracts or debts, the protection rackets, the need to maintain market control through intimidation.
Right. Organized crime stuff.
Yeah, this is organized crime violence, where the product and the market are the reason for the violence, not necessarily the state of mind of an individual consumer at that moment. So to really address drug-related violence effectively, you have to attack all 3. The psychopharmacological triggers, the economic desperation, and the systemic market structure. It's multifaceted.
That makes sense. Okay, so from the chemical environment, let's pivot to the socialization environment in section 1.4, upbringing. This seems to be where some of those structural problems start to really imprint on the individual. We have a pretty clear list from the sources of environmental risk factors linked to violence in the home.
Yeah, and these factors describe what you could call a developmental minefield. They include things like absent or deviant parents, which removes effective role models, inconsistent discipline, which creates a world without reliable rules or consequences, physical abuse, of course, lack of supervision, and a heavy reliance on physical punishment as the main form of discipline. If a child's early life is just characterized by violence and instability, they basically learn that aggression is the only reliable currency for solving problems or getting needs met.
And the evidence connecting this early abuse to later crime is, well, it's chilling. The sources note that children who were victims of abuse early in childhood fall into a high criminality risk group later in life. It really creates this cycle of intergenerational violence.
Yeah, it does. And to help us visualize this kind of destructive cycle, the sources actually outline a specific 4-stage process. It models how escalating violent behavior is learned. It's called the violentization process. It's a powerful tool, I think, for understanding that transformation from victim to offender.
Okay, let's walk through those 4 stages. It starts with the brutalization stage. What happens there?
So in the brutalization stage, the child is subjected to aggressive subordination, often by their primary caregivers. They're abused themselves, maybe coached by violent peers, or sometimes just forced to witness extreme violence happening around them. They start to internalize the lesson that violence is necessary, maybe even normal, even if they aren't using it themselves yet.
Okay, so they're learning the script, basically.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Then comes the belligerency stage. This is where the individual starts to fight back, but they're still kind of tentative. They begin to recognize that violence might be the answer for them, but they haven't fully committed to the identity of being a violent person yet.
So they're sort of testing the waters, maybe seeing if it works.
Yeah, exactly. Then the individual moves into the violent performance stage. This is where they successfully use violence. And crucially for this stage, they begin to gain a reputation. They're seen as tough, dangerous, effective maybe. This positive reinforcement, whether it's respect or fear from others, really solidifies the behavior.
Ah, so it gets rewarded in a sense.
It does,
Whoa.
within that context. And finally, there's the virulency stage. At this point, violence has been completely internalized and validated for that person. They're often alienated, seeing themselves as separate from mainstream society, and they view violence as their only viable means of existence, really. They're fully committed to a violent worldview.
That progression really highlights the profound impact of constant exposure to violence, which is our next category, isn't it? People exposed to it, especially kids in high-crime environments, they seem to react in one of two major ways just to survive.
That's right. They either internalize the methods and adopt violent behavior themselves, kind of following that violentization process we just discussed.
Yeah.
Or they become what the sources call crusted over. Essentially, they build up these thick psychological defenses. They become emotionally desensitized, just shutting off to the daily reality of brutality around them as a coping mechanism.
And the statistics on exposure, they're just impossible to ignore. Between 30 and 40% of children who report exposure to violence also display significant violent behavior themselves.
Yeah, that's a huge percentage.
And specifically, exposure to gun violence apparently doubles the chance a young person will later engage in violent behavior. That doubling statistic, that implies a really immediate, rapid learning curve for adopting lethal behavior.
It does. It suggests that witnessing that specific type of violence has a particularly potent effect.
And this learning isn't just happening within the family, it's also cultural, which brings us to section 1.5. This is the whole concept of a subculture of violence.
Right. This is the idea that in some communities, violence isn't just accepted, it's actually expected. It becomes a product of shared cultural beliefs, values, behaviors, often thriving in poor, disorganized neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities are scarce and formal justice systems might be mistrusted or seem ineffective.
So the key concepts here include disputatiousness. And this isn't just being argumentative, right? It's more like a cultural script.
Exactly. It's a culture where instead of maybe walking away from a perceived slight or insult, the immediate cultural expectation is to engage in conflict. It's like a hair-trigger reaction that demands retaliation and the defense of one's honor, often publicly.
Okay.
And of course, this gets formalized in the gang subculture. In gangs, violence is often a necessary requirement for gaining status, for protection, for maintaining territory. In those specific settings, violence becomes rational, predictable, and even functional for group survival and identity.
And zooming out even further, the sources say that national values also play a significant predictive role in overall violence rates. That's a remarkable insight that the broader national character can actually breed aggression that then manifests locally.
Yeah, our sources indicate that certain national characteristics are predictive of higher violence rates. These include things like the approval of violence as a quick retaliatory method, the glorification of machismo, that aggressive hypermasculine posturing, political corruption, and critically, a perception of an inefficient or unfair justice system. If people feel the state can't or won't deliver justice reliably, they're more likely to revert to personal enforcement, to taking matters into their own hands.
And when we look specifically at the United States, which, statistically has higher violence rates than many comparable developed nations, the sources trace this back, partly at least, to a deeply ingrained frontier culture.
Yeah, that American frontier legacy. It was historically characterized by racism, a really strong preoccupation with personal honor, and out of necessity maybe, self-defense in the absence of strong, centralized authority. This legacy, the idea that you have the right, maybe even the responsibility, to defend your honor violently, arguably continues to contribute to higher rates of assault and homicide compared to nations with different historical foundations.
Okay, so that comprehensive look at the roots, really going from the brain all the way up to the subculture and national values, that sets the groundwork for understanding what those acts of violence actually look like in the eyes of the law. Let's move now into Section 2 and start examining specific categories of violent crime, starting with the most serious, homicide.
Right. So when we analyze homicide, we really have to move past the general idea of just killing someone and adopt the precise legal definitions. This is Section 2.1. These distinctions are critical because they determine the severity of the charges and the potential punishment.
Okay, so we start at the top with first-degree murder. What's the defining characteristic there?
The key here is premeditation. The act was planned, deliberated, thought out in advance. It wasn't impulsive.
Okay.
And this category also includes a really powerful legal concept called felony murder.
Right. I've heard of that. How does that work exactly?
The felony murder rule basically states that if a death occurs during the commission of another dangerous felony, say armed robbery, arson, kidnapping, that sort of thing, the offender can be charged with first-degree murder, even if the killing itself was accidental or wasn't specifically intended.
Wow, okay. So just being involved in the underlying dangerous felony makes you liable for the murder.
Exactly. It holds individuals accountable for the foreseeable, dangerous consequences of their high-risk criminal actions. Now, contrast that with second-degree murder. This typically requires deliberation, meaning the act was intentional, there was intent to harm or kill, but it lacks that element of planning or premeditation needed for first degree. The killing might be impulsive, but it's still intentional.
Okay, so intentional but not planned out beforehand. And then we have manslaughter.
Right. Manslaughter is usually divided into voluntary and involuntary, but broadly it covers unlawful killings without malice aforethought. Voluntary manslaughter often applies to killings committed in the heat of passion, maybe during a sudden, intense fight or argument where there was no prior intent to kill. Non-negligent manslaughter is the term used here.
Got it. And there's another specific legal concept mentioned in the sources, born and alive. What's that about?
Yeah, that's connected to the crime of feticide. Historically, for a homicide charge to apply, the victim generally had to be legally considered a person, which often meant being born and alive, capable of independent life. Feticide laws have evolved and expanded in many places to specifically criminalize the killing of unborn fetuses, reflecting a really complex and ongoing legal and ethical evolution around the definition of life and when homicide protections began.
Okay, that's complex. Let's look at the nature and extent of murder. You mentioned earlier there's some good news.
Relatively speaking, yes. The good news we extracted from the data is that murder rates, generally speaking, have been declining in recent years in many Western countries, including the U.S.
Okay, that's good.
However, the demographic patterns are strikingly consistent over time. Homicide tends to be overwhelmingly an urban crime. It happens much more frequently in cities than in rural areas.
And overwhelmingly male, you said.
Overwhelmingly male, yes. 90%, 90, of those arrested for murder are male. This speaks volumes about those connections we discussed earlier between socialization, maybe machismo, and aggression.
Yeah, 90% is stark.
It is. Furthermore, the crime is overwhelmingly intraracial. Victims and offenders are typically of the same race.
Okay.
And the sources note a particularly tragic statistic. About half of all murder victims in the U.S. are young African-American males. Also, individuals arrested for murder typically have a history of long involvement in crime, suggesting they are often people who have perhaps progressed fully through that violentization process we talked about.
The fact that it's overwhelmingly intraracial seems to connect directly back to that subculture of violence theory, doesn't it? People are typically harming those in their immediate social orbit, often in disputes over honor, status, drugs, within their own communities.
That's a very strong link, yes. And to help organize the motivations and context, criminologists often categorize murderous relations based on the relationship between victim and offender. Acquaintance murders are the most common. Then you have intimate partner murder, sexually based murders, stranger murders, which are actually rarer than media portrayals suggest, and the tragic category of school murders. These categories help law enforcement profile offenders and maybe target prevention efforts more effectively.
Okay. Moving on to Section 2.2, we need to define the landscape of multiple murders: serial, mass, and spree. These terms get thrown around a lot in the media, often interchangeably, but legally and psychologically. They describe three really distinct phenomena.
They are very distinct, yes. Let's start with serial murder. The standard definition requires the killing of 3 or more persons in 3 or more separate events. The defining feature is the temporal gap, that cooling off period between the murders. This allows the killer to return to their seemingly normal life, maybe blend in, and often plan the next attack.
Right, and the motivations vary.
They do. Serial killers are broadly categorized based on apparent motivation or type. You have wanderers, sadists, psychopaths, or sometimes those who rationalize their killings through some kind of twisted ideological view.
And crucially, the sources mention that about 10 to 15% of serial killers are women. That challenges the sort of common media stereotype, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. While the majority are male, female serial killers definitely exist and often have different methods or motives. And the FBI uses detailed profiling systems, not just for psychological insight, but for practical control, trying to help law enforcement narrow down geographic search areas, predict potential victim types, or anticipate the killer's next move.
Okay. Then you have mass murder. How is that different?
Mass murder is entirely different in its temporal structure. This is the killing of 4 or more victims by one or perhaps a few assailants within a single event. The violence is concentrated in both space and time. It's one horrific explosion of chaos, essentially.
One event. And are there typical profiles here too?
Yeah, researchers like Fox and Levin identified 4 general types of mass murderers based on motivation. The revenge killer, who targets a specific group or institution they feel has wronged them, like a workplace or school. The love killer often involves a distorted sense of mercy, like a parent killing their family and then themselves. The profit killer, killing to gain wealth or eliminate witnesses to another crime. And the terrorist killer, whose goal is to send the political or social message through the violence.
Okay. And finally, spree killers. This is where the legal distinction gets even more technical, right?
It does. Spree killing is kind of a hybrid. It's not confined to a single outburst like mass murder, so the killings happen in different locations. But it also lacks that significant cooling off period that defines serial killing.
So it's faster than serial, but more spread out than mass.
Exactly. It's often characterized as a rapid, seemingly chaotic succession of killings across multiple locations over a relatively short period, often involving the killer being actively on the run from law enforcement. Think of it as a prolonged, intense chase or rampage, rather than a calculated, planned project like serial killing, or a single-site attack like mass murder.
That clarity really helps understand the different dynamics and possibly the different psychologies at play. A serial killer plans a sustained project. A mass murderer executes an instantaneous attack. A spree killer seems to be acting out of relentless, immediate chaos.
That's a good way to summarize the core differences, yes.
Okay, let's transition now to a very common crime that still requires careful legal definition. Assault and battery, Section 2.3. Most people, myself included probably, use these terms interchangeably, but legally they're distinct, and understanding the difference can actually mean the difference between facing charges or not, or what kind of charges.
Precision is absolutely mandatory here, legally speaking. Battery is the offensive. Touching it requires actual physical contact, however slight, done offensively or unlawfully.
Okay, battery, touching.
Right. Assault, conversely, requires no actual touching. Assault is defined as intentionally causing fear of immediate harmful or offensive contact in another person by word or deed.
Ah, so just the threat is enough.
If it causes reasonable fear, yes. For example, if I threaten to punch you and I raise my fist in a menacing way and you genuinely fear I'm about to hit you, that's an assault. If I actually connect with a punch, that's battery. You can absolutely be charged with assault without ever laying a finger on someone, provided you successfully induce that reasonable fear of imminent harm.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. Looking at the extent, FBI records show a huge volume of assaults. Something like 800,000 annually, roughly 275 per 100,000 people.
That's right, a very high volume crime. And the profile of offenders is pretty consistent with other violent crimes. Typically young, overwhelmingly male, about 80%, and interestingly, often white in the aggregate statistics for assault, unlike homicide patterns.
And geographically, same patterns.
Similar patterns, yes. Higher rates in urban areas, peaking in the summer months for some reason, and often concentrated in the southern and western regions of the U.S., according to the data.
But the problem with tracking assault, as you mentioned, is the high rate of underreporting, right?
Exactly. The National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS, which asks people about their experiences rather than just relying on police reports, indicates that only about half, maybe even less, of all serious assaults are ever actually reported to the police.
Half. Wow.
Yeah. And this underreporting is particularly relevant when we look at the high-volume crime of assault that happens in the home, within the domestic sphere. That's often hidden.
Right, and assault in the domestic sphere is often where future violence takes root, linking right back to that brutalization stage we discussed earlier. This includes child abuse. How is that legally defined?
Child abuse is generally defined as any physical or emotional trauma inflicted on a child for which no reasonable explanation can be found.
Okay.
It covers a wide range of harm. And the causes listed by the sources are tragic and familiar. Generational family violence, the cycle repeating itself, the added stresses and complexities of blended families sometimes, and the impact of social isolation and alienation, cutting families off from support networks.
And beyond physical child abuse, the domestic sphere covers other forms too.
Yes, it's a broad category. It includes sexual abuse exploitation through rape, incest, or molestation by family members or other adults in positions of trust. There's also parental abuse, where parents are the ones targeted by their children, which is a topic often less publicized, but definitely happens. And of course, spousal abuse, which the sources chillingly note has been a continuous pattern throughout recorded history, sadly. Our sources also specifically mention dating violence, which is a growing concern, especially among younger demographics, and this often includes something called relational aggression.
Relational aggression, what's that?
It's where the violence isn't necessarily physical hitting, but is focused on inflicting emotional or social harm. Things like manipulation, isolating the person from friends and family, constant put-downs, severe emotional cruelty, controlling behavior. It's psychological warfare, basically.
Okay. Our final category in this major crime section is robbery, section 2.4. Again, we need the exact legal definition to set it apart from just simple theft or larceny.
Robbery is specifically defined as the taking or attempting to take anything of value from a person's care, custody, or control by force or threat of force or violence, and/or by putting the victim in fear. The key element is the confrontation with the victim and the use or threat of force. That's what distinguishes it from burglary or theft.
And the incidence, how common is it?
Annually, estimates hover around 325,000 robberies reported in the U.S., still a very significant number.
And the sources categorize different types of robbers, mentioning the calculating robber.
Yes, this underscores the finding that robbery, despite its inherent high risk and potential for violence, often remains fundamentally a crime of rationality and planning, at least for some offenders. They weigh the risk versus the potential reward, they select targets, they choose times and locations to try and maximize their potential gain and minimize the chance of getting caught. It's not always purely impulsive.
Okay. And specific forms.
We also define specific types like carjacking, which is the particularly dangerous act of attacking occupied vehicles, often using significant force or threat for the purpose of stealing the car, and acquaintance robbery, where the offenders specifically target someone they know.
Why target someone you know seems riskier.
The calculation there might be that the victim is known to carry cash, or perhaps the offender thinks the victim will feel too embarrassed or compromised to report the crime to the police because they know the attacker. It adds a layer of complexity to the investigation and prosecution.
Okay, we've established the roots of violence and looked at the legal definitions of general assault, homicide, and robbery. Now let's focus specifically on one particularly complex and historically fraught crime: rape.
Right. Moving into Section 3, we focus entirely on the specifics of rape. The etymology itself is quite striking. The word comes from the Latin rapere, which means to take by force. And sadly, this crime has existed and been recognized as a crime for as long as human history has been recorded.
And the history is pretty distressing, isn't it? Because legal interpretations haven't always centered on the victim's autonomy or experience. The sources detail practices like heiress stealing back in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that was a recognized practice where men would abduct and often sexually assault wealthy women specifically to force them into marriage and thereby acquire their wealth and status. The focus was on property and lineage, not consent.
Property. Wow. It wasn't until the late 15th century, the sources say, that forcible rape was formally outlawed in a way that started to shift the legal focus, albeit very slowly, towards protecting the individual's bodily integrity.
That's right. And we absolutely must emphasize the connection between rape and organized conflict. The sources stress that rape has been tragically associated with armies and warfare throughout recorded history. It's often used systematically as a weapon of conquest, terror, and ethnic cleansing, aiming to humiliate, demoralize, and dismantle entire populations.
That's horrifying. Looking at incidents today, the UCR data shows about 84,000 rapes or attempted rapes reported annually in the U.S. But, and this is a critical detail that just needs repeating, rape is monumentally underreported.
Hugely underreported. The source material indicates that estimates suggest as many as 10%, 1 in 10 of all adult women, have been raped during their lifetime.
1 in 10. That's millions of victims. It implies that the official statistics we work with are just, well, the tip of a massive iceberg of trauma, doesn't it? So much goes unaddressed due to stigma, fear, Maybe a lack of trust in the justice system.
Absolutely. That 10% figure suggests a scale of harm far beyond what official crime reports capture.
And given that underreporting, the statistics are just a proxy, really. The crime itself also takes many forms, which the sources meticulously distinguish, reflecting all the varied contexts and relationships involved. Can you list some of those?
Sure. The sources identify several types, highlighting the distinctions. There's gang rape, serial rape, acquaintance rape, which is actually the most common form, date rape, rape on campus, marital rape, which wasn't even legally recognized as a crime everywhere until relatively recently. Statutory rape, where the issue isn't force, but the victim's age, rendering them legally unable to consent, and even the technically complex category of rape by deception, where consent might be obtained through fraud or trickery.
Okay. Section 3.2 is where we really delve into the core question. Why does rape occur? The academic sources present a whole diverse array of causal theories, which kind of illustrates that there's no single definitive answer, right?
That's exactly it. The lack of one single theory tells you how complex the motivations are.
So what are some of the main theories?
Well, they range quite widely. You have evolutionary and biological factors proposed, sometimes controversially, explaining it as maybe a distorted expression of male reproductive strategy. Then there's male socialization, the idea that boys are sometimes socialized to be aggressive, dominant, and to view women as objects. Other theories focus on psychological abnormality in the offender, or social learning, where aggressive sexual behavior is learned from peers, media, or witnessing abuse. There's also the gender conflict view.
What does that one emphasize?
The gender conflict view interprets rape not primarily as a sexual act, though sex is the weapon, but fundamentally as an assertion of power, dominance, and control within a patriarchal social structure. It's about violence and subjugation more than sexual gratification itself. And of course, some theories do focus on sexual motivation or gratification as a primary driver for some offenders.
The existence of all these different theories really confirms that any effective intervention has to be equally multifaceted, doesn't it? You need to address potential biological issues, correct flawed social learning, challenge those damaging cultural power dynamics, all at the same time.
Exactly. There's no single magic bullet.
Now, the legal response to rape, historically, it's centered heavily on the difficulty of proving the crime, hasn't it? And the central legal issue is always consent.
Yes, and historically, the laws were incredibly difficult for victims. They often demanded proof of extreme physical resistance or visible injury, which effectively punished victims for surviving an assault without fighting back in a way that left marks, or for freezing up out of terror. The focus was often unfairly shifted onto the victim's behavior rather than the assailant's actions.
But there have been reforms.
Thankfully, yes. Modern legal reforms in many places have aimed to fix some of these historical biases. We've seen the development and strengthening of shield laws, for example.
What do shield laws do?
Shield laws limit the ability of the defense attorney to introduce irrelevant or prejudicial information about a victim's prior sexual history during a trial. The idea is to shift the focus back onto the specific incident and the actions of the defendant, rather than putting the victim's character or past on trial.
That seems crucial.
It is. These reforms, coupled with other legislation aimed at providing better support services for victims and enabling their restoration, are part of broader international trends. The global legal community is increasingly recognizing rape as a severe crime against personal autonomy and dignity, regardless of the relationship between the parties or the victim's history. But proving it in court still often comes down to that difficult issue of consent.
Okay, we now shift into our final section. Section 4, looking at a category of violence that's maybe growing in prominence, or at least in legal recognition, emerging forms of interpersonal violence. These are crimes often defined by unique motives or specific modern contexts. We're starting with Section 4.1, hate crimes.
Right. So a hate crime isn't a separate act in itself, but rather a criminal act like assault, vandalism, intimidation, where the motive is key. It's targeting a victim based solely upon their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. That bias motive is the core defining factor, distinguishing it from an otherwise identical crime committed without bias. Exactly. The underlying act is already a crime, but the hate motive often leads to enhanced penalties or specific charges. And those motivations, the roots of hate, as the research calls them, tend to fall into three distinct categories. Understanding these helps law enforcement figure out the attacker's psychology.
Okay, what are the three?
The most common motivation identified is actually thrill-seeking.
Thrill-seeking, really?
Yeah, offenders Often young males acting in groups target victims perceived as different just for excitement, maybe for peer bonding or to gain bragging rights. They often lack any deep ideological commitment to hatred. It's more about the illicit rush and perceived vulnerability of the target.
Okay. What's the second type?
Second is reactive hate. This is typically committed in response to a perceived intrusion or challenge to the offender's territory, neighborhood, or perceived way of life. The attacker sees the victim or the victim's group as being out of place or threatening, and they're reacting defensively out of fear or perceived displacement.
Like defending their turf, almost.
In a sense, yes. And the third type, generally considered the most dangerous, is mission hate.
Mission hate.
This is driven by a deeply held, usually extreme ideological belief that the targeted group is inherently evil, inferior, or a threat that must be eliminated, harmed, or driven out. These crimes are often highly planned, methodical, and sometimes linked to organized hate groups. The violence is seen by the offender as necessary to further their cause.
Okay. And how common are reported hate crimes?
Well, FBI data typically reports around 7,000 hate crime incidents annually in the U.S., but like rape, experts widely agree this is almost certainly significantly underreported.
Why the underreporting here?
Victims might fear retaliation, further victimization, they might distrust the police, or in some communities they might feel reporting won't make a difference or could even make things worse. What is notable in the reported data is that racial bigotry remains the motivation for more than half of all reported hate crimes.
And the most common type of act.
The most common form is actually simple intimidation. Things like verbal threats, graffiti, hate mail actions designed to induce fear and make the victim feel unsafe and unwelcome. Of course, assaults and vandalism are also common. This prevalence motivated the creation of specific hate crime legislation designed to impose enhanced penalties when that bias motive is proven in court. Okay, next up, let's look at Section 4.2, Workplace Violence. This is a major concern, obviously, for employee safety, but also for the economy, right? We need to identify the factors that can turn a regular workplace into a potentially violently hostile environment.
Yeah, the sources list several key contributing factors, and they often seem rooted in organizational failure or perceived unfairness. Things like management-induced injustice employees, feeling unfairly treated, consistently overlooked for promotions, maybe abused by leadership.
Perceived injustice is huge.
Sexual harassment is another major factor. Jealousy among colleagues, maybe over promotions or perceived favoritism, and also negative responses to workplace provocation, often triggered by events like layoffs, demotions, or disciplinary actions that feel unjust to the employee. It sounds like a toxic mix where an individual's sense of dignity or fairness gets stripped away.
It really is. And the economic cost of these kinds of toxic or dangerous environments is immense. The sources cite that the total cost of workplace violence, when you factor in lost productivity, legal fees, increased security, workers' compensation claims, medical expenses, runs more than $4 billion annually in the U.S.
$4 billion. That's staggering.
It is. And the implicit question the sources raise, can workplace violence be controlled, is usually answered by focusing heavily on prevention. Things like implementing clear, fair, and consistently enforced policies regarding conduct and discipline, maybe improve pre-employment screening, and definitely providing effective conflict resolution training for both managers and employees, trying to de-escalate tensions before anger spirals out of control.
Makes sense. Finally, in Section 4.3, we look at stalking. This is a crime that seems to have gained much more legal definition and public recognition relatively recently. Maybe partly because the digital age has made non-physical forms of harassment and proximity easier to maintain.
That's definitely a factor.
Yeah.
The precise legal definition is critical here because stalking isn't usually about a single act.
Right. So what is the definition?
Stalking is defined as a course of conduct directed at a specific person that involves repeated actions. These actions could be repeated physical or visual proximity, like showing up where the person lives or works, non-consensual communication, unwanted calls, texts, emails, letters, or verbal, written, or even implied threats. And importantly, this course of conduct must be sufficient to cause fear in a reasonable person.
So it's the pattern, the repetition, and the fear it causes. That's what makes it stalking.
Exactly. It's the pattern that creates the terror and disruption in the victim's life.
And why do stalkers stalk? What's the motivation? It's often not direct financial gain like robbery.
The intent is often not a specific tangible outcome, like robbery, or even immediate sexual assault, although those can sometimes occur. More often, the core motivation seems to be about asserting power and control over the victim. The sources identify a clear and well-established relationship between stalking and other emotionally controlling and physically abusive behaviors, particularly in the context of former intimate relationships.
Ah, so it's often an extension of domestic abuse.
Very often, yes. It frequently emerges when a victim tries to leave an abusive relationship. The stalking behavior becomes the offender's way of refusing to accept the dissolution of the relationship or the loss of control over the victim. They're trying to maintain that connection and dominance, even if it's through fear and harassment. #outro. Well, we have journeyed through an incredibly detailed catalog today. Causes, patterns, legal definitions. It's a lot to take in. But the synthesis, I think, reveals a really profound truth. Interpersonal violence is almost never rooted in just a single cause. It seems to always be a complex convergence of factors, maybe individual pathology, environmental exposure, socialization, cultural tolerance, or even glorification of aggression.
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing these subtle distinctions we talked about, that's hopefully the key takeaway for you, the listener. We now have, I hope, a clearer understanding of the difference between, say, an assault, the threat, and a battery, the actual contact, or the huge policy difference embedded in understanding those three distinct links connecting substance abuse to violence, the chemical effect, psychopharmacological, the desperation effect, economic compulsive, and the market structure effect, systemic. Structure really does bring clarity to the chaos.
It does. And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, we started this deep dive by establishing that core philosophical conflict. The contrast between the internal biological self, maybe driven by Freud's instincts or differences in brain structure, and the external cultural environment, where someone like Collins sees us as basically passive beings shaped entirely by subculture, social interaction, and socialization.
Right. Nature versus nurture, almost, writ large. So as we leave you today, maybe consider this provocative thought based on all the evidence we've discussed from, the neurological scan evidence all the way to the concept of machismo in national culture. Which of these core forces, the internal biological and psychological self or the surrounding cultural and social environment, offers the most effective leverage point for meaningful societal intervention and prevention of violence?
Yeah, if we have limited resources, limited attention, should we focus more on fixing the brain, maybe through therapy or medication where appropriate? Or should we focus more on restructuring the culture, changing social norms, addressing those systemic inequalities? Where do we get the most bang for our buck in trying to reduce violence?
That is, I suppose, the ultimate question of criminology and public policy in this area, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's definitely something worth mulling over long after this deep dive is over. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll catch you next time for the next deep dive.